I love a good story. And it's been that way since I was a child. And I love stories for a number of different reasons, one of which is that stories are beautiful. Because there's nothing like the perfect beat with a verse on top. I'm thinking Common, J Dilla, because that's a story. But stories are not just beautiful because of how they sound, they're beautiful because of how they're told. When a perfect story is told at the right cadence, with the right voice inflections, with characters you can relate to, in a universe you can only visit in that story, it's beautiful. But images can be stories. Think of the emotion that's evoked when you see the cherry blossoms in DC unfold, or a child take his first steps, or a beautiful car rolling down the street. But I don't just love stories because they're beautiful, I love them because they're powerful. They're powerful in terms of the emotion they can evoke from an individual. Think of how you feel when you hear someone's story of triumph over an issue, or the closeness that's created whenever someone shares their story with you, or the intimacy that's created when you share your stories back in return. But I don't just love stories because they're beautiful. I don't just love them because they're powerful. I also love them because they're key to how humans get things done. If you think about it, there hasn't been anything in human history that's been accomplished without a story. There's no religion, no political party, no pyramid that gets built without someone telling a human a story. Because stories are the only way we can share ideas, concepts, culture, get people motivated. But I don't just love stories because they're beautiful. I don't just love them because they're powerful. I don't just love them because it's how humans get things done. They've been key to how I've gotten things done. To this point in my life, I've led over 10,000 hours of projects and programs. I've helped fintech startups raise millions of dollars in startup capital. And I've connected with a number of people through the power of telling my own personal story. And as I begin to think about the future, the world of tomorrow, a big idea entered my head. What if getting more things done tomorrow is dependent on becoming a better, more immersive, data-informed storyteller today? And to explain how I've come to this conclusion, I'm just going to state something that's obvious. The culture is moving faster. We all know this to intuitively be true. We feel it. We feel it deep inside. Things are moving so fast. There's so much information coming at us. But oftentimes we forget the markers of that change, that rate of change is all around us. So to explain it, I'm going to use one of my favorite subjects, music. I'm going to take you back to the world of 1960s. Dwight D. Eisenhower is president. Inflation is just above 1%. And the sound of the airwaves was my hometown, Motown. The Temptations, also known by the Elgins if you're from Detroit. And Elvis Presley. What's interesting is that when you account for all of the cover albums, the duets, that Elvis and the Temptations only had about 6 or 7 albums in the 60s. When we move towards the 80s, things get interesting because they speed up. Ronald Reagan starts off as president. Wall Street is the big thing. The Macintosh computer is coming out. Michael and Prince are battling out on the airwaves. And Prince in the 80s had 9 studio albums. We move forward to today. Inflation's a lot higher than 1%. Political parties change left and right. But one of the greatest storytellers alive, Nas, has had 6 albums in 3 years, and most music execs even tell new artists they need to come out with new content every 10 weeks. Now, this increase in rate of change is not just something that we see in music. We see it in politics. We see it everywhere around us. There's so much happening all the time. The implications of this are pretty broad, but for today's purpose, what you need to know is that means humans have more information coming at them all the time. As a matter of fact, the average human today has access to more information in one day than someone did 100 years ago in their entire life. That means there's more information coming, more noise, more distractions. And if you want to motivate people and connect to them to get them to do things, you've got to become a better, more immersive storyteller. Now, why stories? Well, pretty simple. Stories are the shortcut to human connection. There's some pretty interesting things that happen when you're telling a story. Did you know that your brains actually get in sync with the brain of the storyteller when you're listening? And there are parts of your brain associated with imagination and prediction that light up when you're hearing a story that they don't other times. That's important because you need imagination and prediction to be able to empathize with people, to imagine yourself in their situation, to predict how you would feel if you're going through those same issues that they're going through. And what's really powerful is that when a story is told at the right cadence, over the right beat, comment over Jay Dilla, and that story is told in such a way that invokes imagination and prediction, it actually affects our heart. It can change how you believe. Now, the beauty of storytelling is that storytelling itself is a skill. And because it's a skill, we can learn it, get better at it, master it, and deploy it in ways that we can use to get things done. Now, before I get into all about how you become a better storyteller, it's one important thing you need to know. Every single story a human has ever told another human can be summarized into a handful of story archetypes. The first story archetype is the person in whole. And in this archetype, at the beginning of the story, there's an everyday person doing everyday things that we all can relate to that finds himself in trouble, in an issue, in a hole, usually by no fault of their own. And by the end of the story, they've learned something, they've climbed their way out. And by the end of the story, they're back to being an everyday person doing everyday things that we all can relate to. We like that story because it's kind of like our lives. There's another story archetype you need to know about, comedy and tragedy, which actually, believe it or not, are the same thing. Now, I mentioned before that it's important that we have prediction when we're hearing a story because we predict what happens next in the storyline. In tragedy and comedy, what happens is things go left or right in a way that we didn't expect. Sometimes it's tragic. Other times it's kind of funny. Tragedy and comedy. We like that because we relate to it. We can see ourselves in situations where things went left or right. The next story archetype is actually my favorite. It's one that's littered all throughout hip hop. It's called the rags to riches. It's almost like the American story. At the beginning of the story, our main character is usually in a situation that's below average, below what everyone is expecting and everyone else is experiencing in life. And through wisdom and grind and power, they fight their way out. And by the end, they're on top of the world. We love that story. We can relate to that story. We aspire to that story. But the last story archetype is the most important. It's called the journey or quest. Every superhero story we think about, even the story of Jesus, in some way is built on the back of the story archetype of the journey or quest. And essentially, at the beginning of the story, there's a character that's unknown. They're on their journey to get a job done. There's some sort of friction that happens. Typically, there's some sort of wise sage that comes along and helps them along the way, gives them wisdom. They get through the story, and by the end, they've learned something new about themselves, but also they've helped other people along the way as well. We love the journey story. As a matter of fact, product design is based on the journey story. We call it the customer journey. It's beautiful. But I want to say, I don't just love stories because they're beautiful. I don't love stories just because they're powerful. I don't love stories just because they're key to how we get things done, and they've been key to how I get things done. Stories are also key to how you get things done and how you see yourself. And to explain this, I'm going to tell you the story of Cliff Young. Cliff Young was a sheep farmer that came from a family of sheep farmers in Australia. In his entire life, he had been a sheep farmer, caring for sheep in a field, not very known. He decided one day that he wanted to become an ultra marathon runner. I don't know if you know anything about ultra marathons, but a marathon is roughly 23 or so miles. An ultra marathon can be hundreds of miles. So Cliff Young, who'd been a sheep farmer his entire life, never having any training at all, decides he's going to enter a race to run between Sydney and Melbourne, Australia. It's about 550 or so miles. And the way these ultra marathons work is that typically people run, they run during the day, they rest at night, run during the day, rest at night. Cliff Young decides that he's going to run this race straight, all day, all night, and he does it by this little shuffle that's now called the Cliff Young Shuffle. What's interesting is that Cliff Young wins this race. What I find so interesting about this race is that Cliff Young has run against some of the greatest athletes in the world, and he beats them. And Cliff Young is 61 years old. When he wins, people ask him, hey, how'd you do it? He said, you know what? It was a story I was telling myself. He imagined himself having to run on the backside of his field. A storm was coming, and he had to save his sheep. And he kept replaying that story in his mind. That's how he did it. It was a story he told himself. Because stories are not just beautiful. They're not just powerful. They're not just key to how humans get things done. They haven't been just key to how I get things done. They're key to how we motivate ourselves to do hard things, to do things. So I want to end with this question. What story are you telling yourself? Thank you.